Yes, I can. He endured great personal struggle through one of the most artistically repressive regimes of our time, yet wrote some of the most powerful and emotionally wrought music there was. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Dmitri Shostakovich. Shostakovich was born in St. Petersburg in 1906 and was destined to be the middle child. His musical talent lay dormant until the age of 9, when he showed aptitude on the piano by being able to play back pieces he had heard at his lesson the week before, by ear. This ability, combined with an early pull towards composition, got him into the Petrograd Conservatory at the tender age of 13. His compositions began taking a modernist turn towards the languages of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, much to the chagrin of his composition professor. He also didn't seem to particularly care that much about politics, which is how he actually initially failed a test on Karl Marx's ideology. He just didn't study. His graduation from the conservatory came with the premiere of his first symphony, which was his first step into a larger world. Its successes led to premieres after premieres around the globe under the batons of the great conductors, while Shostakovich himself was trying to make a name for himself, not just as a composer, but also as a pianist. The press was critical of his dry and choppy style of playing, and soon afterwards, Shostakovich decided that it'd be best for his career to focus exclusively on composing, as opposed to trying to lead a dual life between the keyboard and the manuscript paper, which is good because his second and third symphonies came soon after. The second was a pro-Soviet patriotic anthem subtitled To October, which was met with great acclaim, while the third was a little more modernist and so wasn't as understood by audiences. As a pianist, Shostakovich was still to perform, but he was only to do so with his own music throughout the rest of his career. Around this time, Shostakovich began writing his first opera, The Nose. It's about a guy whose nose comes off and grows to the size of a human being and has adventures. You know, as one does. It isn't given a great many performances due to these very intrusive stage requirements. Shostakovich felt that the music was really inseparable from the staged drama of the piece, and so he didn't want excerpts from the opera to just go and be performed in concert, which was the standard practice. But it was anyway, and people didn't understand the music. Granted, people didn't understand the opera when they saw that either, because it's, about a nose that comes to life, but still. Its stage premiere came in 1930, and it wasn't revived in the Soviet Union until 1974. But Shostakovich was undaunted, and he really wanted to achieve as much success in the opera house as he had in the concert hall with his symphonic works, and so he began writing another opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. It's not actually an adaptation of Shakespeare, it just uses the term Lady Macbeth, but in any event, it was premiered in 1934 to immense acclaim. Audiences loved it, critics loved it, the officials of the party loved it. Everyone just really enjoyed this piece, until Stalin went to see it, and Stalin hated it. Shostakovich had been the poster child for Soviet art, but 1936 saw his fall from grace into continuous fear of his life. It all started with an article in Pravda entitled Muddle Instead of Music. Some translations have Chaos instead of music. Anyway, it was anonymous, but most scholars believe that it was actually written by Stalin himself. Thereafter, critics who had previously praised Lady Macbeth walked back to their praise, because they didn't want to be put on any official lists. After this, Pravda even continued to go after his more accessible pieces, so Shostakovich just was left completely terrified, especially as people who he just had contact with were suddenly shot, or shipped off to the gulags in Siberia just for knowing him. Shostakovich was forced to publicly apologize for his missteps with the authorities, and in fact withdrew his fourth symphony, which was at that point being rehearsed. Lady Macbeth would eventually return to the stage in 1962 in a heavily edited version called Katerina Izmailova. It was different enough from Lady Macbeth that Shostakovich felt it necessary to assign it a different opus number. Shostakovich's son Maxim, who would end up becoming a stellar conductor, particularly of his father's works, thought that while Katerina Izmailova is more of a censored version, the fact that it came later in Shostakovich's career meant that the orchestration is a little more fine-tuned. However, if an opera company is going to produce Lady Macbeth, they're going to produce Lady Macbeth. They're not going to produce Katerina Izmailova. Shostakovich's attempt to repair his image with the Soviet authorities came in the form of his Fifth Symphony. He wanted to avoid being branded as a formalist, which was the general insult and general put-down used by Soviet officials for any art, specifically composition, that they did not like. Shostakovich wanted to conform on a surface level to Soviet realism, a conservative, pro-Russian, pro-Soviet Union, basically propaganda in art that Stalin wanted to see in everything produced by artists of the Soviet Union. Shostakovich had come into contact with Mahler's Fourth Symphony sometime earlier, and saw it as a model for disguising meaning into something where there was apparently none. The resulting Fifth Symphony thus became a model for many of the pieces that Shostakovich was to write throughout the rest of his career, disguising anti-Stalin messages in music that was really outwardly about being pro-Russian nationalism. Its premiere was followed by a raucous ovation, and party officials at first tried to claim that this was simply the members of Shostakovich's claque going to applaud no matter what happened at the premiere. But eventually they realized that this is kind of what they wanted. The party wanted an official artistic rehabilitation from Shostakovich because, for one thing, Shostakovich was still quite popular, and two, if they exerted their authority over Shostakovich, they could really cement their power as an organization. Shostakovich himself described the Fifth Symphony as a Soviet artist's response to just criticism, and the party was basically forced into accepting that. He was now feeling a bit safer in his life, and Shostakovich began turning to string quartets. He really felt like these pieces were more intimate. He could put his own compositional thoughts and desires into these. He wasn't having to conform to anything else. He could just do what he wanted. And they're much more intimate, and they're much more personal statements. Shostakovich found himself in Leningrad when Germany broke the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. Shostakovich attempted to enlist but was prevented from doing so because they cited his bad eyesight. But he was working at that point on his Seventh Symphony. While German forces worked their way day by day towards Leningrad, Shostakovich and his family stayed in the city, and he completed the first three movements of his Seventh Symphony while he was in there. When the siege of Leningrad began, Shostakovich and his family were evacuated via helicopter, where he completed the Seventh Symphony. And then the parts were copied out and sent back into the city to be performed. Leningrad's local symphony orchestra had been depleted to 14 starving members, and a call was put out to all the front lines for any musician to come back into the city to perform this piece. And several members of the orchestra died of starvation during rehearsals. While they were just playing this piece, they would just fall over dead. But rehearsals went on and the show went on, and it was blasted over loudspeakers to German forces, by all reports completely destroying their morale. The piece fast became known as a Soviet artist's depiction of the struggle of the Soviet forces against the invading Nazis. After the immense boost of morale for the beleaguered Soviets at the premiere, the score was smuggled out of the Eastern Bloc via microfilm, and various American conductors struggled and really started backbiting each other, trying to get the score first, so they could have the honor of conducting the Seventh Symphony's Western premiere. As the tide of the war turned towards the Soviets in 1943, Shostakovich wrote his Eighth Symphony, which is uncharacteristically dark, and really he couldn't have gotten away with doing so if he wasn't so popular in the West. The fact that he was the one guy, the one artist really bridging the gap between East and West in a way that was so profound, the party couldn't do anything to him. And so even though they might have thought that the Eighth Symphony was somehow being sympathetic towards fascism because it was so dark and not all happy and joyful that the Russians were winning, they couldn't do anything about it. As a result, the party put an effective moratorium on performances of the Eighth Symphony until 1956. He was still so beloved for the Leningrad Symphony that the party really could not touch him for the Eighth. But Stalin had had enough of Shostakovich's subversions and denounced him along with many other formalist composers in 1948, and again Shostakovich felt as if he was living in fear of his life. To even stay alive, all of the denounced composers had to publicly apologize for any Western influence in their pieces, and vowed to thereafter write music that was accessible and only accessible to the proletariat. Shostakovich continuously lived in fear of his arrest, and he was deprived of his conservatory post, which meant he was deprived of money. He had to turn to film scores, which were inherently conservative, a job that he could easily get, and it was something that Stalin really liked. He still wrote personal works, adding to his cycle of what would amount to 15 string quartets, but he called these desk drawer pieces. He knew that they weren't to be played until Stalin died. His large publicly performed concert works were aimed at a second official rehabilitation, such as his oratorio of the Song of the Forests, whose formulaic composition won it the Stalin Prize for its Soviet realism, but yet threw Shostakovich into a major bout of depression. He always liked using folk music in his work, specifically Jewish folk music, which always went hand in hand with his own work, but now he basically had to in order to avoid the charge of formalism and to stay alive. Again, one of the few things keeping him alive was the fact that he was popular in the West. He was one of the only links they still had. He was sent to a conference in New York which was humiliating for him, as he was forced into becoming a puppet for his own government. Ironically, this was the same conference that got Aaron Copland in trouble with Senator Joseph McCarthy. But that's another story. Stalin died in 1953 on the same day as Sergei Prokofiev. And even though Shostakovich and Prokofiev had had their differences during their careers, Shostakovich still immensely respected Prokofiev, and he put his neck out on the line by going to Prokofiev's funeral instead of Stalin's. Under pain of imprisonment or death, Shostakovich went and paid his respects to an indefatigable Russian composer who had endured much under the Stalinist regime in his own right. Stalin's death meant that Shostakovich could finally premiere some of his desk drawer pieces, and he could relax some of his formalist tendencies of recent years and incorporate some of his own musical language back into his large, publicly performed concert works. He wrote his 10th Symphony, which is often interpreted as his bitter triumph over Stalin simply by the fact that he had outlived him. In much of his music, he represented himself using a musical code: D, E flat, C, and B. D-S-C-H, essentially spelling out his own name using musical pitches. Relations between East and West thawed slightly, especially artistically, as Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic were allowed to tour the Soviet Union, playing Shostakovich's works. Khrushchev wanted to mend the relationship that the party had to Soviet artists, and so Shostakovich officially joined the Communist Party to become the General Secretary of the Composers Union. The move has been widely debated by scholars as to how much was free will and how much was blackmail, although it's much more likely that it was closer to blackmail than it was free will. His name became used by the party to denounce formalist composers, or just any avant-garde composer they didn't like. Around the same time, he fell in love with his compositional pupil, Galina Utsvoldskaya, in many ways Shostakovich's compositional heir in the waning years of the Soviet Union. She refused Shostakovich's proposal of marriage after his wife Nina died in 1954. His dual compositional life was renewed, writing his Lenin-inspired 12th Symphony at the same time as his much more personal 8th String Quartet. The String Quartet is much more personal, intended as a requiem for himself, to his own memory, as it were, while the symphony is titled the year 1917 as a celebration of the October Revolution. His health began to deteriorate, doubtless due to his love of cigarettes and his love of vodka. Insert your own Russian joke here. His right hand became affected by polio, hampering his ability to write music, and he suffered a heart attack after attending the premiere of his 11th String Quartet. His music was allowed to become more modernist in tone, the apotheosis of which was possibly the 14th Symphony, which is based around poems pertaining to the themes of death, but most would point to the 15th String Quartet, 6 extremely slow movements that add up to a dying man's fear of death, although his son Maxim pointed out that it could be as much about the death of the era than his own personal death. Up to the end, Shostakovich continued writing music, although battered by physical afflictions and the stunning emotional horror he had endured during his entire career. For what it's worth, Shostakovich wanted the 15th Quartet to be played so slowly that flies would drop out of the air and the audience would leave just because they were so bored. The 6 continuous movements last over 30 minutes in the key of E-flat minor, the farthest possible tonal cry from the C major of his first quartet. There's been a significant matter of scholarly debate as to how much of Shostakovich's music is actually intended to be subversive towards the Soviet regime, and as an extension of that, what Shostakovich actually believed in his political views. A purported memoir called Testimony was published in 1979, and although its authenticity is questionable, it still corroborates a lot of what his friends and family said about his political views after his death. In fact, its publication led to Maxim Shostakovich defecting to the West. But its lack of authentic origin throws its position as Shostakovich as a lifelong dissident into a matter of some question. The manifestation of anti-Stalinist views in his music is pretty much without doubt, but how much of it was anti-Stalinist and how much of it wasn't remains a matter of significant debate, sometimes called the Shostakovich Wars. Shostakovich was prone to weird and nervous quirks, even before officials came down on him and his music. He would habitually synchronize all the clocks and watches that he owned, and would often send letters to himself just to figure out how well the postal service was operating. Although left incomplete at his death, the 15 string quartets were intended to be part of a cycle of 24, written in all major and minor keys. in a manner thought through similarly to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. In his music, he was always looking for new paths and directions, and was critical of any technique that took hold of a large chunk of the compositional world. In fact, he called the 12-tone music a great mistake in a 1958 interview. He disliked the 12-tone method for its repressive hold that he saw over the composers who used it, and he was unafraid to use it as a technique, but he was always careful to do it in certain contexts, and often when he uses a 12-tone row, he does it in a tonal context, as he does in both his 12th and 13th string quartets. When he used them, they were to express depression and fear outright, avoiding what Shostakovich called an artificial limitation of possibilities. He seemed to have been a believer in socialism and communism, abhorring the oppressive totalitarianism of the Soviets, but not the purported ideology. Shostakovich once said that if they cut off his hands, he would write music with his pen between his teeth. And this sense of relentless drive and determination led him to become a figure of hope and resistance against authoritarianism, for whom music was his battle cry.